Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual education on the topic of prostate cancer research. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to join and then we'll begin. All right, it looks like we have a few attendees, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's virtual education. My name is Kara Urrutia, and I'm an oncology outreach coordinator here with the Samaritan Cancer Resource Center. We're so excited for today's presentation on the topic of Prostate Cancer Research 101. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is being recorded, and a recording will be available online at a later date. We are using the universal mute button for this presentation, so please click on the chat box in the top right corner to ask any questions. We are going to be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation, and as time allows, at the end of the presentation, we will be doing a Q&A portion. All right, so I am pleased to introduce our first guest speaker today. Mitchell Heath is a member of the Samaritan Health Services clinical research team. He specializes in oncology clinical research with an emphasis in prostate cancer. Mitch graduated from Colorado State University with a Bachelor's of Science in Exercise Physiology. Mitch has worked for Samaritan Health Services for the last 7 years and with the Samaritan Cancer Program for the last 3. In his spare time, Mitch enjoys running and spending time with his wife and 2 sons. Without further ado, welcome Mitch.
Thanks, Kara. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. So I really appreciate getting the opportunity to talk to everybody today. I guess the best thing to do to start is just to give you an idea of what oncology research is like at Samaritan and what kind of research we do. So what our clinical research team is and why we exist, if you look at our mission statement, really one of the big reasons why Samaritan does research is because, I mean, first and foremost, it's the right thing to do. When you think about healthcare and how quickly things are changing constantly and getting better at treating different diseases, I think it's really important that Samaritan wants to be a part of figuring out what the right thing to do is to treat patients. So another big reason why we exist and why our research team is a part of our organization is because we really want to, especially in oncology, make sure that patients aren't having to drive to Portland and to offer cutting edge access to clinical trials closer to home. We've had several times in the last few years where there's been a clinical trial available somewhere else, and we've been able to do something similar to that here for our patients. And we are able to offer clinical trials not just here in Corvallis, but we take care of patients in Lebanon, Albany, as well as on the coast. So we're at all 5 of our hospitals. And another big reason why our research team exists, especially with oncology, in order to be an accredited cancer center, you have to get about 6% of your oncology patients every year onto a clinical trial. So this is a standard because research is so important and clinical trials are such an important part of cancer care. And 6% might not sound like a lot, but I'm going to talk in a sec about how complicated clinical trials are and how difficult it is to get patients onto them. 6% at a cancer center our size, which isn't a very big one, is still somewhere around 100 patients every year. So that is a lot of work. And to do that work, there's about 5 of us on our team at any given time. It's a mix of nurses and research coordinators like myself. And we work with our oncologists to conduct clinical trials. We don't just do oncology research, we do all kinds of stuff. In fact, for the last 8 months, most of our time has been dedicated to COVID research. So I'm actually really excited to get to talk about oncology because it's something I know a lot more about. So we really work for the oncologists. Our job is to support those doctors in conducting the research. It's their research. We just are kind of the people that help coordinate the care because it's so complicated when you go on a clinical trial. So who benefits from clinical trials? Whenever I talk to a patient about going on a trial, I think one of the things I always emphasize is that because we're doing something that's experimental and might not necessarily be known, side effects and those kind of things, you get a lot of extra attention. I think anyone who goes on a clinical trial is getting the best care possible. You get more people with eyes on you, checking on you. You have like a whole team of people dedicated to making sure you're okay. You also are getting more imaging done, so more scans. You're getting more lab tests. And so you're getting all that extra attention, and things can get caught faster, and we're able to treat side effects and those kind of things more aggressively. So the last thing to note on the slide is the last little bullet point. So the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, it's called usually just referred to as NCCN in oncology. It's sort of like the gold standard. Whenever someone's diagnosed with cancer, it's sort of the oncologist's job to know what these guidelines are that are set by the NCCN, because that's how they're supposed to treat you. So I know some of you are not necessarily oncology patients. You're seeing urology. So I apologize. A lot of my talk is oncology. But I will talk about other stuff that's more prevalent in the urology space too in a sec. But the NCCN at the bottom of all their guidelines for every kind of cancer says that the best management of any patient with cancer is in a clinical trial, and I truly believe that. Not everybody is a match for a clinical trial, and it's not something that everybody's going to do. Like I said, 6%. So there's a good chunk of people who will never go on a clinical trial. And oftentimes that means that we already have a really good standard of care, but it also can mean that there's things we can be doing that we're not. And maybe we need to do more research there. So a little bit more about what we do. So at any given time, we usually have about 20 clinical trials open locally. So that means those are clinical trials that we could enroll patients on here at our hospital or our cancer center, specifically in oncology. So in our oncology trials, we usually have some kind of trial open for lung, breast, prostate cancer, as well as multiple myeloma and other blood cancers. We do everything in between, but those are kind of like the big ones that we always have something for. But those are really specific, so it's not always going to cover everybody. And then I think the last thing to note about just like a general like what we do thing is that our clinical trials span cancer treatment from start to finish. So what I mean by that is we don't just have clinical trials that are like scary drugs that have never been tried before in people. We actually don't really do that at all. We try and have clinical trials that help prevent people from getting cancer, trials to help people not have their cancer come back, trials to improve people's quality of life while they are receiving treatment. Because I think research is really at its best, not when it's a last-ditch effort, when there's no other options, and it's almost like a palliative thing. It's research is best when we're doing it because we want to make the world a better place. So I think that's really our mission. So how do clinical trials work? This is just kind of like a quick overview. So I think recently, probably a lot of people listening to this have learned more about clinical trials and the FDA and drug approval processes than they'd ever like to, with all the stuff that's happened with COVID and vaccines. So a lot of this stuff you've probably already heard, but just to kind of give you like a brief what we do. So there's three main types of clinical trials that we work with, and they're kind of the big three just in general across the board. There's pharmaceutical trials. So these are like big pharma companies, and they sponsor clinical trials, working with their own investigative agents to try and get those drugs approved by the FDA. There are NIH-sponsored trials. So the National Institute of Health is kind of the big umbrella for federal trials. So this is the federal government, and they work a lot with academic centers. Like for instance, the closest one to us would be OHSU or also Stanford, to work with those organizations to kind of pool resources and money together to do clinical trials. And then the last one, which is a smaller pool, are investigator-initiated trials. And this is something that we actually do quite a bit of, not in oncology at Samaritan, but in other disease types. So rheumatology is a big one that we do, and now COVID as well. An investigator-initiated trial is basically when a doctor has an idea, and they're just one doctor, but they have this idea and they want to do a clinical trial. It happens a lot with our residents because they have to do research as a part of their residency. So we support that too here. And those are always exciting because a lot of times they're they're not ideas that are like trying to make $1 million for a drug company. They're just ideas to try and help people. So who can go on a trial? So this is kind of like the not so fun part of research. It's really, really hard to get on a clinical trial. So when you design a clinical trial, what you're trying to do is prove that, in the case of like a drug, for instance, you're trying to prove that a drug works with a very specific group of people to make them better. I guess is the simplest way to put it. So in order to make sure everybody looks the same in your clinical trial, you have to put sometimes several pages of eligibility criteria together to make sure that everybody who goes onto the trial has the same kind of cancer, the same kind of comorbidities, the same like relative place in their cancer spectrum. So they're all very similar. In order to do that, though, like I said, it's several pages of different boxes you have to check, basically, of lab values and imaging requirements and treatments you can and can't have had in the past. So it ends up being a lot of work to get somebody to go on a clinical trial. And because of this, clinical trials aren't really like advertised. So we don't go out and into the world and try and find patients via advertising. Most of the time, people don't find us for clinical trials either. We find the patients by screening people's charts, by oncologists knowing what to look for and bringing us into the fold. I think there's kind of a misconception that to go on a clinical trial, you have to kind of seek it out yourself, but usually people find you because getting patients on the clinical trials can be so difficult, and all those requirements are kind of only known by the people running the trials. So there's 3 like big phases of clinical trials. You probably heard about these recently, like I said. Phase 1 is usually like first in human, so that means that we're trying something that has never really been done in a person before. Phase 1 trials are usually like super intense. We don't really do them here because they're just so much extra work. It require way more staffing than we have. But OHSU and Providence do them in Portland. Sometimes these trials are really promising. Other times they don't even really know which cancer they're trying to treat. They just have a drug that looks interesting, and they will have anybody with cancer show up that wants to be in it. There's also phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So these are a little bit further along. Phase 2 is kind of like safety and making sure that the drug is safe. They've kind of figured out what they want to do with it. And then phase 3 trials are really for efficacy. So when you get to the point where you're doing a phase 3 trial, it's usually very large scale, trying to prove that it works in the population that you've designed your trial for. And then kind of at the end of all of that is drug approval. So then the FDA looks at all of your data that you've collected after you've done all those things, and hopefully what happens is they look at it and it's safe and it works, and then they approve it. So right now, I guess another example in the news is they're looking at Pfizer's vaccine and trying to see if it's safe for everybody to take and if it really works. So hopefully that happens soon. And that's kind of the big news, I guess, about those things. So I guess now I'll just talk about prostate cancer. Sorry to have said all the other stuff. But I thought it was important for everybody listening to this to kind of know the background of clinical trials in general, so that some of the things I say make sense. So I think when you look at the numbers for prostate cancer, really any cancer, there's a lot of different ways to look at percentages and like mortality rates and those kind of things. But for me, these numbers are the most staggering when you look at it this way. About 1 in 9 men are going to be diagnosed with prostate cancer in their lifetime. And that's a super high number when you think about how many people you know. That means that the degrees of separation for you knowing somebody who's affected by prostate cancer is a very small number. It's pretty hard to find somebody, I think, just like breast cancer, who doesn't know somebody who's had prostate cancer affect their life. I also have heard an oncologist that I really respect a lot say something that kind of impacted me. Prostate cancer is one of those cancers where, theoretically, if every man lived to be like 200 years old, all of them would get prostate cancer at some point in their life, just because it's something that happens. It's a part of our our bodies. The average diagnosis age for a man with prostate cancer is about 66. So it's a cancer that's happening later in life. That kind of goes with what I just said. If you live long enough, you might eventually get prostate cancer. I think the other thing that people don't necessarily know about prostate cancer is that it causes more deaths in men than any other cancer, but other than lung cancer. So that's about 1 in 41 men are going to die from prostate cancer, which to me feels like way too many men. So I guess the next thing is, what do we do about that? So a tale of two cancers. So prostate cancer can be looked at in two different ways. So I know we have people from urology, so they're at a different point in their cancer care than people who are oncology patients, and that's kind of what I want to speak to now. I'm going to divide the information about prostate cancer research into sort of two different groups. So I think my mouse works and you can see what I'm pointing at, but just in case it doesn't. So above the red line here, this is breaking up prostate cancer into basically two different groups of people. So you've got this up here, this localized and regional group. And when you look at people who are diagnosed where their prostate cancer hasn't spread anywhere else in their body when they're diagnosed, after 5 years, almost 100% of those people are all still alive. So when we talk about cancer and survival rates, we almost always are referring to this 5-year survival rate. So I don't 100% know why that was what we picked, but that's what we did. So whenever you hear survival rates, that's pretty much always what it's referring to. So these people who are lucky enough to have their cancer caught early, which the good news is like high 90% of people who have prostate cancer are diagnosed at this point. After 5 years, they're still almost all alive. So that's the good news. The bad news is if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer and when you're diagnosed, it's already metastatic, you've got this number down here to look at. And this is a scary one because only about a third of men diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer are going to live 5 years after that diagnosis. So this is all these numbers I think is important to note are at the point of diagnosis. So that doesn't mean that if you're in this group, you're not going to have prostate cancer come back and be metastatic and then be in this number. And that also means that this is a very small number. I think it's important to note that this, being diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer as the first time you ever hear about your prostate cancer is pretty rare. But it does happen and the outcomes aren't good. So we have to get better at it. I'm going to just go back this slide. So I'm going to refer to this as the early stage group, and this is going to be an advanced stage group down here. So when we talk about research, what we're really talking about is questions and answers. So when you design a clinical trial, you're asking a question like, will this drug work? And you're hoping to get an answer like, yes, it does. But when you talk about clinical trials, you're not just talking about drugs. There's definitely a misconception there too. It's clinical trials are everything. It's lifestyle interventions. It's seeing if quality of life is improved by simple things like just talking to a therapist or exercising or eating a healthier diet. So when we talk about earlier stage prostate cancer, as you saw on the last slide, when 100% of men are living 5 years, what can we be doing better for them? Because just because we're doing good at keeping people alive doesn't mean we're doing a good job of taking care of them. So we look at things like improving quality of life. That's one of the big questions, I think, in earlier stage prostate cancer is how do we make sure that these guys that are being diagnosed they've hopefully got a lot of life left to live. How do we make sure that they get the most out of it? We're also looking at things like early detection because we're catching these prostate cancers, but there's kind of a cost. I mean, PSA testing, if you Google it, it doesn't take very much scrolling to find that there's some controversy in how accurate it is. So how do we reduce the amount of unnecessary biopsies that guys are getting? How do we get better at predicting outcomes kind of based on high-risk genetics? How do we start doing genetic testing to know who's going to have a better outcome or who we need to treat more aggressively? And what those treatments should be if we treat them more aggressively before they have metastatic cancer to make sure they don't get it. Then the last big question in earlier stage research that people are asking right now is, what should you do at that initial diagnosis? Should you have surgery? Should you do radiation? Or should you just do observation? I've met probably hundreds of guys who have prostate cancer at this point, and no two stories are the same. There's been some research that suggests that, depending on who you see for your first visit after your diagnosis, that's kind of what you do. So if you see a surgeon first, then you're probably gonna have surgery. If you see radiation first, you might have radiation. And then if you see a doctor who wants to treat you more conservatively, you might just have observation. These are all like really nuanced questions, and a lot of the decisions of those initial treatments are kind of very personal. A lot of cancer centers that are bigger than ours have prostate cancer navigators that help make these decisions and tell everybody their options, because no two men are the same in what they want to get out of their treatment. So now talking about like the questions we're asking in the more advanced stage, this metastatic setting. In the last 10 years, the landscape for prostate cancer in this setting has changed dramatically. We've gotten way better at treating prostate cancer that's metastatic. So when do we use these new drugs that we have, I think, is a big question. There's like 3 really big drugs that have been approved over the last 3 years, or last 10 years, sorry. And figuring out what order they go in, because they're all pretty similar, figuring out how early or late we need to use them. And then when we're using these kind of drugs and when we have these metastatic prostate cancer patients, how do we improve their quality of life? Because, these drugs are extending lives, which is awesome, but there's a cost for it. And the side effects of those drugs are pretty similar to the side effects of Lupron. And anyone who's ever had Lupron knows that it's saps your energy, and it decreases your sex drive, and it gets rid of your muscle tone, and it's a really hard thing. And these drugs are doing that even more. So how do we get better at that? And then how do we extend life? So how do we make sure that 31% of men, that number gets smaller, because we want to extend life as long as possible, and finding new drugs, finding new combinations of drugs that we already have is probably what's going to do that. So when people were signing up for this talk, there were a lot of really good questions. I was actually super impressed, because they were kind of the same things I was already thinking about when I was asked to do this talk. So the first kind of thing someone mentioned was asking about like immune therapy. So if you have a TV and you've watched it in the last 5 years, you know at least sort of that immunotherapy exists, because there's like a commercial with some smiling people at like a wedding, and it's on 3 times a day. So you've seen a Keytruda commercial or an Opdivo commercial, and everybody looks great and they're having a great time. But what is immunotherapy? Like, what are they actually trying to tell you to do? So immunotherapies are a newer class of drug. They've become really popular recently because they've had so much success in treating lung cancer and melanoma in particular. So these drugs, what they do, so cancer is really good at figuring out a way to evade your immune system. And so one of the ways it does that is, I describe it to patients as it basically wears like a mask, and your immune system just like floats by these cancer cells and doesn't see it. And immunotherapies, what they do is they sort of tag all of those cells so that your immune system is able to recognize them by binding to an antigen on its surface. And then your immune system is able to, on its own, fight cancer. So sounds really cool, but the bad news is it's not very promising in prostate cancer so far. It also hasn't been super successful in breast cancer either. There's some exceptions to that, but for some reason it just doesn't really seem to work great in either of those cancers. That being said, there are 2 drugs right now that have been approved for men with prostate cancer. One's been around for a while, actually. It's called Provenge. We don't do it here, but I know they offer it in Eugene. It's kind of for guys who are diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer, who are not really having any symptoms earlier in their diagnosis, and it doesn't stop cancer growth, but it might increase survival in some patients. So needless to say, it's not really like the oncologist's first choice to recommend to you, but there are some benefits to it, so that's why it's still around. And then there was a recent approval, kind of after you've tried all the other stuff in metastatic prostate cancer, you can try Keytruda, which is one of those drugs that is always on TV for lung cancer, but you can try it in prostate cancer. And it's got mixed reviews. I mean, about 1 in 20 patients on the trial that got the drug approved had a response to treatment. And I think this is the important thing to know. I hate using this word when I talk about cancer, but in some ways, immunotherapies are like a miracle. And the reason for that is it's giving patients who used to not have a very good chance of living for a long time a lot more time. It's a really, really cool thing to see. However, the amount of people that it's doing that for is very low. There are some people who just happen to be like excellent responders to immunotherapy, and the majority of people aren't. So that kind of speaks to this number here with this 1 in 20 patients. So that's why it's sort of at the end of all the other things you try, you can try this. So the next thing to talk about, so this is more metastatic stuff. So these are all things that have already happened, but now the question is, what do we do next? So CRPC, what that means is it's castrate-resistant prostate cancer. So these are men who are chemically castrated with their testosterone levels being like almost nothing, and they have a rising PSA anyways. So what this indicates is that whether we can see it or not, you probably have prostate cancer progressing somewhere in your body. So this is not a good thing. This is kind of like, it means that the drugs we've been trying aren't working, and now we got to be more aggressive. So CRPC is broken up into 2 categories. There's M0 and there's M1. So M0 just means that they can't find any metastasis anywhere on imaging. They don't know where it is, but your PSA is going up, so it means you're probably progressing. And there's M1, which is the majority of CRPC diagnoses, and that means that they can see the metastasis somewhere. And there's a little bit of controversy I'll talk about on the next slide about like, does M0 even like really exist? Can you really have PSA levels rising without being able to have metastatic cancer somewhere? And so as our ability to detect cancer with imaging is getting better, the chances of being diagnosed M0 are going to probably decrease even more. So these 3 drugs, Xtandi, Zytiga, and Erleada, have all been approved in the last few years. And they're all really good drugs. It's really exciting to have access to this. They're also all very expensive. And now we have to decide what order should we be using them in and when should we be using them. There's a lot of people who want to try and maybe use these drugs more aggressively, potentially before we even have a diagnosis of metastatic prostate cancer. And then there's also people who think that maybe we shouldn't be that aggressive. Maybe we should wait and delay it. And the big problem with these drugs is all 3 of them are pretty similar in the way that they work. And one of the things that we know is that once you've had one of them, you become less sensitive to the other ones. So figuring out which drug is the best to do first and then second and then the third would also be really important to know as well. I mentioned this already, but imaging is another place where we're seeing some progress in research. The one thing that I'll highlight is at Stanford, the Stanford Body MRI program is really, really cool. It's a bunch of super smart radiologists and physicists, and they've come up with a more advanced MRI that's able to see cancer that probably wouldn't be detected by other MRIs or CT scans. So this is something that if we were able to make it universal, it could help us avoid some of those false positive biopsies or doing a biopsy that's unnecessary because the PSA testing isn't that accurate. It also might significantly reduce, like I said before, the amount of men who are being diagnosed M0 or not metastatic, but they have CRPC. This is just an MRI that shows an example of a prostate cancer that was caught that wasn't even caught on the biopsy. They did a biopsy of it and didn't even see it in the pathology, but then they did an MRI and were able to see it on the MRI. So that's how impressive these new MRIs are. And Stanford's one of the places that's doing it. Theirs is like a big program. I know that they're in other places in the country. There's like better MRIs that are specific for prostate cancer, but they're not everywhere, partly because it's just so expensive to have the technology to do it. And it also hasn't necessarily been proven to be what's best for patients yet. A lot of this is still experimental. So even though it looks awesome and it seems like it works, and until you do a big clinical trial, you don't know if this is what we should be doing for every patient. Another really good question that we got ahead of time is the link between prostate cancer and breast cancer. So this is something that is relatively new for us to be learning about, and it's really exciting. So BRCA1 and BRCA2, or BRCA1, I just say BRCA. BRCA is something that you might not know about it, but you probably do. If you remember, like 10 or 15 years ago, Angelina Jolie had a prophylactic mastectomy, and it was because she found out she had these genes. So these are the genes that we know in women increases your risk dramatically of having breast cancer or ovarian cancer. And it turns out these genes also are increasing your risk of getting prostate cancer. They also increase your risk of prostate cancer if you get it being more aggressive. So it's estimated that 1 in 4 men might have a BRCA mutation, but this is an estimate. The BRCA1 gene doesn't increase your risk as much as BRCA2, so there's some nuance to that as well. The other thing is, like, I think it's important to know that this just increases your risk. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get prostate cancer. So there's definitely like it's a tricky place, because on the one hand, it would be great to genetically test everyone who has prostate cancer, or even just everyone, period, to know, what your risks are for all these different things. But on the other hand, if we do that, if we were to say start genetically testing patients in urology, and we were to see if you have BRCA or not, we could find out you have BRCA, but then it's like, great, like, what do we do now? Like, we don't know what to do next. We don't have like a treatment to prevent you from getting prostate cancer more aggressively than we already do. So knowing that you have BRCA at this point might not necessarily do anything other than give you anxiety, until we get better at figuring out what to do to reduce those risks. It's not something that we necessarily can do a lot with now. However, that's early stage prostate cancer, but in advanced prostate cancer, BRCA has given us the ability to use the same tools that we fight breast cancer with and ovarian cancer with to use in prostate cancer. So this is a really good thing. Recently some drugs were approved. I think only BRCA was approved, but then Parza is showing a lot of promise. I might have that backwards. But these are drugs that have been approved to treat patients. They're called PARP inhibitors. I can't tell you what that stands for. I used to know it, but I've forgotten it. This is another one of those things that's being done later after you've tried some different treatments for men that are MCRPC. We actually did a trial recently here locally with a drug that's a PARP inhibitor called talazoparib. It was a trial that combined it with enzalutamide. So enzalutamide is Xtandi. I mentioned that earlier. And it was combining these two drugs. And I think, it was an okay trial, because it's hard to know if you're doing too much. I think that's the other big question with prostate cancer, is sometimes prostate cancer is almost like a chronic disease where it's going to hang around for a long time and you're probably going to outlive it. And so you don't want to be too aggressive. That's one of the things researchers trying to figure out, is what's like the least aggressive thing we can do to have the best outcome still to improve quality of life. And so this trial we might find, we don't know the results of it. It wasn't our trial. It was someone else's that we did. Hopefully we find that it worked, but it might not work for everybody, which is, I think, another thing that's really important about research, is finding out who these things work for. So another thing that I wanted to mention, as far as like things that we're doing here at Samaritan for our community. So about a year ago, this is kind of like my project that I'm really proud of. We applied for a grant at OHSU. They do a lot of really cool research with their prostate cancer patients and breast cancer patients involving exercise, which is kind of like like my background, so it's exciting to get to apply this to oncology. So one of the trials that they're doing at OHSU, it's called Exercising Together. So their trial is actually colon cancer patients as well as breast and prostate patients. And basically what it is it's, we know that when you're diagnosed with prostate cancer or breast cancer or colon cancer, one of the really like not as much talked about, but definitely is happening things, I guess, for lack of better words, is that you experience a loss of self-confidence, especially with your intimate partner. It can affect your sexual health, and that decrease in testosterone, especially in men with prostate cancer, is something that affects your relationship with your significant other. So what this trial is we know that when you exercise with a partner, especially your intimate partner, it increases your intimacy. It decreases your depression and anxiety as well. So we're hopefully going to do this online in the winter. It's going to be, like I said before, the sad thing about research is always that eligibility criteria. So it's going to be something that it's not going to be offered to everybody. It's going to be a specific group of people. But I thought it was important for everybody like listening to this to just know that we're doing it, because it's a community effort to try and get this going. SAMFIT's a part of it, as well as our radiation oncologists are supporting it, and Samaritan as a whole is supporting it, as well as this grant funding we got from OHSU. So ironically, we were going to do this program. We had everything set up and good to go in March, and then pretty much the day that we were going to start doing it, everything locked down. So we spent the summer trying to figure out, what the best thing to do is. And instead of doing it in person, it seems like what makes the most sense is to try and do it online. So that's where this is going to move to. The moving parts of doing that are significant, so it's taken a lot longer than I'd hoped, but hopefully in the winter you'll hear something about this happening. And the last thing to talk about, so we had a question about alternative treatments with oncology in general, and then also just prostate cancer. So this is a tricky thing to talk about because there's definitely like I said in this first bullet point, a spectrum of validity in the sense that there are some things that are really cool and exciting, and there's other things that are just kind of like a little bit out there that might not help people. And in some cases, like for instance, like with cannabis, like medical marijuana, it seems like there's a lot of anecdotal like data and patients that are sharing stories that like it really is helping them with their nausea or their pain, especially if they're going through chemo. And so our oncologists are supportive of it for the most part, of patients trying this. But the problem with researching marijuana is that federally it's illegal, so it's almost impossible to get federal dollars to fund your research. So there's very little that we like genuinely know from like well-designed like gold standard clinical trials. So it's really hard to know whether or not that's like the best thing to do. In other cases, research is kind of unnecessary, or it's already shown it doesn't work with some of these alternative things. So I caution you, because if it exists, you can probably find a clinical trial to support the claim that it should be done. However, you've got to really be wary of who's doing the trial, of really small numbers in their trials, of grandiose claims like that it's going to cure cancer, or there's a few things out there that, like, I mean, for one thing, right now, THC isn't really regulated in the same way that other drugs are, and it's being used to treat like everything under the sun, and the odds of it actually helping all of those things are very slim. So while it might help some things and while it might be beneficial, you got to just be careful in what you decide to do. And I think that's why it's always important when you're making a decision like this to talk with your oncologist or your urologist, first. Oftentimes, in the conversations that I've seen patients have with their doctors, it seems like these alternative treatments can often be like really safe, supportive care. And if you're getting a benefit out of it, or if you feel like it's helping you and it's a safe thing to be doing, there's no reason not to. But I think it always is important to make sure that you're, listening to what your doctor says, and if they say it could interact negatively with something that you're doing for your cancer care, it might not be the best choice to make. But that being said, that's kind of my talk. I don't know if there are questions or not. I'm going to let Aaron say some stuff, and then I'll be back for questions if there are any. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mitch. That was very interesting presentation on clinical research and prostate cancer. Like you said, my name is Erin Dunn. I'm the Samaritan Oncology Outreach Coordinator, and I'm going to be discussing some Samaritan Cancer Resource Center services. So our mission at the Samaritan Cancer Resource Centers is to help support anyone touched by cancer. So we are located in both Corvallis and Albany, and we offer a wide variety of support groups, a prostate cancer mentorship program, educational opportunities, and much more. The best way to know about what's coming up at the Cancer Resource Center is to get on our monthly newsletter distribution list, or just give us a call. We're happy to support. So receiving a cancer diagnosis can be a life-altering event filled with uncertainty and challenges. To help provide support and guidance, the Prostate Cancer Mentorship Program pairs newly diagnosed patients with mentors who have been through similar diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Mentors are prostate cancer survivors themselves, and they can help share information about their own cancer journey regarding the side effects, coping strategies, and recovering obstacles. If you are interested in our mentorship program, it's very easy to get signed up for that. Just 3 easy steps. The first is to call the Samaritan Cancer Resource Center and let them know that you are interested. You'll fill out a registration in order to best be paired with your mentor, and then that mentor will reach out to you. We also offer group support. So we have a man-to-man support group that meets every first and third Thursday from 4 to 6 p.m. Right now, the support group is meeting virtually via Microsoft Teams. So this support group is a space for men to discuss the physical and emotional aspects of dealing with cancer. And you can get more information on that by contacting the Resource Center. Something new that we have starting in January 14th, we're going to be hosting a 12-week transformation cancer support group. So this support group is facilitated by Dr. J. Anna Looney, who is a certified mind and body medicine facilitator. Participants will learn about mind-body connection, how to enhance the quality of life, resilience, and personal well-being throughout simple practices. This registration is required for this, and you can contact Anna Looney at the email or the Cancer Resource Center, and we can also get you that information. So at the Cancer Resource Center, we really want to help reduce any stress throughout the holidays. So we are offering throughout December for patients of the Samaritan Cancer Program a free gift wrapping. So at both the Albany and Corvallis Cancer Resource Centers, we can wrap your gifts for free. We just ask that you give us a call and set an appointment ahead of time. Like Mitch talked about early detection, this year more than ever, I feel it's very important to take control of your health, and a great way to do that is to make sure that you're up to date with your annual physical. This way you can have an opportunity to make the best informed decisions with your healthcare provider about matters like the prostate cancer screening. Early prostate cancer usually has no symptoms, and more advanced symptoms as defined from the American Cancer Society can include problems urinating, including slow or weak urinary stream or the need to urinate more often, maybe especially at night, some blood in the urine or semen, erectile dysfunction, pain in the hips, back, chest, ribs, other areas, weakness or numbness in the legs and feet, loss of bladder or bowel control. You can also learn more about prostate cancer and the Samaritan Urology Services by visiting their website at samhealth.org/urology. So just want to thank you again so much for your time today. I'm going to send this back to Kara to see if we have any questions for Mitch in the chat box.
All right, thank you so much, Mitch and Erin, for your presentations today. We do have a couple questions that were submitted online on registration. I think we covered most of them, but there were two that I would like to go ahead and ask. So this one will be for Mitch. So Mitch, you had mentioned new imaging techniques at Stanford, but are there any new, more sensitive screenings for metastatic cancer available in Oregon?
So I think right now at this time, as far as I know, there aren't. I think Stanford is probably the closest, but your doctors might know better than I do. That's oftentimes the case. So I would definitely ask them, and also just I would Google it too. I think right now though, the closest thing to us would be Stanford.
All right. Great, thank you so much. We did have a question that I'm going to go ahead and answer. It was a question regarding the latest recommendations for diet, foods to avoid, alcohol, etc. In the chat box, I posted a link to our website where we have posted some previous videos that we have recorded. I would really encourage everyone to check out those videos. We have a video with one of our registered dietitians, Athena Nofsiger, who did discuss hot nutrition topics for cancer survivors. And next up, Mitch, we had a question in the chat box. I'm not sure if you're able to see it, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. So it says, following your alternative treatment slide, are you looking at trials for the most promising and commonly found alternatives, such as high-dose IV, vitamin C, IR heat, hyperbaric, low-carb dieting, mistletoe?
We're not. I think right now we're mainly focused on doing stuff that is, I think, a little bit more common as far as prostate cancer treatment goes. Those kind of trials, as far as I know, aren't really available to cancer centers like us to do. They're usually done sort of by like trade groups or kind of by people who might have like a financial interest in that and hope it works, which I guess you could kind of say about a lot of research, but in general, those kind of things aren't really something that we can do just because unless we come up with the research on our own, which is something we don't do very often, it's tough to even have access to that. I think one thing I really should have said earlier is all the clinical trials that we offer for the most part aren't our ideas. All the clinical trials that we're doing, the 20 or so we have in oncology, are someone else is way smarter than us who came up with the idea. And what happens with clinical trials is because it's so hard to get patients onto your trial, you can't just do it at the Mayo Clinic, even though the doctor who came up with it is at the Mayo Clinic. You have to have a network of sites like our Community Cancer Center or OHSU and Providence all across the country, in addition to the Mayo Clinic, to provide enough patients to your trial to show that what you're doing works. And so we just have access to these kinds of trials through relationships with big groups that do research under federal funding, as well as a couple pharmaceutical companies that we've worked with in the past who allow us to do their research on their behalf. So that's kind of how research works when you're not at a big institution. And so partly because of that, we don't do research like that because it's not available for cancer centers like us to do.
All right, let's go ahead and stick around for a few more minutes and see if we get any more questions. I'm going to go ahead and give a brief little summary here and some reminders while we wait for any last minute questions. So we will be emailing out an evaluation link for today's presentation. Look for this via email. Please take a moment to complete this evaluation. These evaluations are really useful to us and they do provide some great insight and feedback for future events. Let's see here in the chat box if we have any questions. All right, looks like we haven't received any more questions. So let's go ahead and close out today's education. If anyone has any remaining questions or questions that come up within the next few hours or days, please feel free to email us at cancerresourcecenter@samhealth.org. We are always happy to assist and answer any questions. And I would really like to give a huge shout out and thank you to Mitch, Aaron, and everyone that was able to attend today. We hope to see you all at our next virtual event and have a great afternoon.